My brother tried illegally evicting me after Grandma's death. Then Grandma's lawyer showed up to give him a brutal reality check. Julius showed up to Grandma's funeral like it was a chore. He was only here for one thing: inheriting Grandma's house. While everyone was sharing memories and crying into tissues, he was on his phone, already posting house for sale pictures. He knew he'd get it. After all, he was the golden child. The second the last guest left, Julius cornered me, pulled out an eviction notice and slapped it on the counter. "You've got 30 days to clear out of Grandma's house," he said in a voice that had that same smugness from when he'd gotten a new bike for Christmas while I got hand-me-downs. I was still grieving the next day when Julius pulled up to the house with a U-Haul and 4 of his frat brothers. They strutted through the front door like they owned the place, carrying empty boxes and rolls of packing tape. They started pulling apart furniture Grandma treasured and laughed while they loaded it in, wondering how much each piece would sell for. I tried to stop them, tried removing Grandma's favorite dresser from the truck, but they just pushed me to the side. "Wait, not that!" I yelled, jumping forward to grab the quilts we made together piece by piece. One of the frat brothers grinned and tried prying it out of my hands. Julius rolled his eyes. "Just let him keep that. It's a dusty handmade blanket. No one's gonna buy it from us anyway," he said plainly. That's when Julius found Grandma's jewelry box in her bedroom. He dumped the whole thing into a garbage bag, rings and necklaces tangling together like they were worthless junk. By the time Mom arrived, the house was already half loaded into the truck, and all the valuables were pocketed. "Why don't you try being happy for your brother?" Mom asked, placing her hand on my shoulder with that fake sympathy face she'd perfected over the years. That's when Mr. Schwartz, Grandma's attorney, pulled into the driveway. He looked at the boxes, the U-Haul, Julius's friends carrying Grandma's antique lamp out the door. "Julius!" he called out. "What are you doing with your sister's property?" Julius laughed. "My sister doesn't own anything here, old man. Dad's dead. I'm the oldest grandchild. This all goes to me." "There's no will," Mr. Schwartz said, pulling papers from his briefcase. "Which means everything goes according to state law?" "Exactly. So it's mine." Julius was already turning back to the jewelry. "No, Mr. Schwartz pulled out an official document. "Under our state's filial responsibility and caregiver statutes, when someone provides full-time care for an elderly relative for over 2 years, they're entitled to the estate over other relatives who provided no care." Everyone fell silent. "That's not a real law," Julius said slowly. "It absolutely is. Your sister moved in 3 years ago. She quit her job. She provided round-the-clock care, changed diapers, administered medications, missed every holiday with friends to stay with your grandmother. Mr. Schwartz looked at Julius. "When did you last visit before the funeral?" Julius's face was going red. "I have a job. I can't just visit any time. Your sister had a real job too. She quit it to prevent your grandmother from dying alone in a nursing home." Mr. Schwartz handed me a document. "She's been documented as the primary caregiver by Grandma's doctors, Medicare, everyone. The law is clear. Caregivers who sacrifice their livelihood inherit over absent relatives." That's when Julius started losing it, stomping his feet, screaming, "But I'm the oldest. I'm the successful one. You're the absent one. You visited twice in 3 years, both times to ask for money." Mr. Schwartz stood up. "The house, the accounts, everything goes to the grandchild who actually loved her enough to show up." Mr. Schwartz handed me the house keys and a small envelope. "She wanted you to have this." Inside was a note in Grandma's shaky handwriting. "My special baby. They called you the family failure. But not anymore." What he read next made Julius listen to 90 seconds and rate me 5 stars on Spotify. "Doing a giveaway for people who did this and show proof on my Instagram. There will be 4 winners, and you get to choose between a Spotify or Amazon gift card." I stood in the empty living room after Mr. Schwartz left, holding grandmother's note with shaking hands while Julius's truck peeled out of the driveway. The house felt violated and chaotic, with furniture pushed around and boxes half-packed, but the keys in my pocket meant I could finally lock him out. I walked to the front door and turned the deadbolt, hearing the click echo through the quiet rooms. My hands were still trembling as I tested the knob twice to make sure it held. The sound of Julius's truck fading into the distance felt like the first breath after being underwater too long. I looked around at the mess he left behind. Grandmother's favorite armchair sat crooked in the corner where one of the frat brothers had shoved it aside. Picture frames hung at odd angles on the walls. A trail of dirt from their boots cut across the hardwood floor that grandmother always kept spotless. I pulled out my phone and called the locksmith, my voice shaking when the receptionist answered. They agreed to come first thing tomorrow morning for an emergency rekey. Tonight I would have to make do. I hung up and stared at grandmother's heavy oak dresser against the wall. It took me 20 minutes of pushing and dragging to move it in front of the door, my muscles burning with the effort. The dresser scraped against the floor, leaving marks that would have made grandmother wince, but she would understand. She would want me safe. I grabbed the quilts we made together piece by piece and spread them on the couch. The familiar weight of them settled over me as I curled up, too exhausted to even change clothes. Sleep came in fits and starts, every small noise making me jolt awake, wondering if Julius had come back. The next morning, I walked through every room documenting the damage and missing items with my phone camera. Julius's frat brothers left scuff marks on the hardwood in the hallway where they dragged furniture. A lamp lay broken in the corner of the dining room, the shade crushed and the base cracked. I took pictures of everything, my hands steadier now in the morning light. The jewelry box sat empty on grandmother's dresser like an open wound. I stood there staring at the velvet interior, remembering how she used to let me try on her rings when I was little. 3 generations of family heirlooms gone, dumped into Julius's garbage bag like they were worthless trinkets from a yard sale. I opened my camera app and photographed the empty box from multiple angles, then started making a list in my phone notes. Grandmother's wedding ring with the small diamond, her mother's pearl necklace, the gold bracelet her father brought back from the war, the cameo brooch she wore to church every Sunday. I tried to remember everything, my thumb flying across the screen as each item came back to me. My chest felt tight as the list grew longer. 40 years of memories reduced to a typed inventory on my phone. The locksmith arrived at 8, a tired-looking man with a toolbox and a clipboard. He changed all the locks while I sat at the kitchen table making my list of everything I remembered being in that jewelry box. The sound of his drill echoed through the house as he worked on the front door, then the back door, then the side entrance grandmother rarely used. He handed me 3 sets of shiny new keys when he finished. I paid him with my debit card, watching my checking account balance drop by $200 that I couldn't really afford to spend, but it was worth it to know Julius couldn't walk in here anymore. After the locksmith left, I went back to my list. The antique brooch with the tiny rubies, the silver locket with grandmother's baby picture inside, the turquoise ring she bought herself on a trip to Arizona. Each item felt like losing her all over again. Julius probably had no idea what any of it meant, what stories each piece held. To him, they were just things to sell, price tags and profit margins. Mr. Schwartz called around noon to schedule a proper meeting at his office tomorrow to discuss next steps and probate procedures. His voice sounded serious and professional over the phone. He warned me that Julius would likely challenge the caregiver statute and I should prepare for a fight that could take months. My stomach dropped at the word months. I told him I understood and wrote down the appointment time in my phone. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table staring at grandmother's note again. Her shaky handwriting blurred as tears filled my eyes. They called you the family failure, but not anymore. I folded the note carefully and put it back in the envelope, then set it on the counter where I could see it. A reminder that she knew, she understood, she wanted me to have this. I spent the afternoon cleaning up the mess Julius left behind, putting furniture back where it belonged, and sweeping up the dirt his friends tracked through. Each familiar object I returned to its proper place felt like reclaiming a small piece of grandmother's memory. The armchair went back in its spot by the window where she used to sit and watch the birds. The side table with her reading lamp returned to its position next to the chair. I found her bookmark still tucked in the mystery novel she had been reading before she got too sick to focus. I swept the floors until the hardwood gleamed again, scrubbed the scuff marks off the walls, wiped down every surface Julius and his friends had touched. The physical work felt good, gave me something to do with my hands while my mind spun through everything that had happened. By the time I finished, the house looked almost normal again. Almost like grandmother might walk out of her bedroom any minute asking what all the fuss was about. That evening, I finally opened the envelope completely and found not just the note but a small key taped inside. My hands trembled as I peeled away the tape and held the key up to the light. It was small and brass, the kind that might open a lockbox or a filing cabinet. The note mentioned a care file in the hall closet. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. The hall closet was packed with grandmother's winter coats, boxes of old photographs and cleaning supplies. I started pulling things out, setting them carefully on the floor. Behind a stack of photo albums, I found a banker's box with a label in grandmother's shaky handwriting. For my special baby. The key fit perfectly into the small lock on the box lid. Inside were 3 years of meticulously organized care logs, doctor appointment records, medication schedules, and Medicare documentation, proving every single day I spent caring for her. The box was divided into sections with labeled folders. Medical appointments with dates and doctor notes, daily care logs where grandmother had written notes about my help with bathing, dressing, meals, medication schedules in my handwriting with her notes in the margins. Thank you for your patience today. You make me feel safe. You are my angel. I pulled out folder after folder, my vision blurring with tears. She had documented everything, every doctor visit, every time a nurse praised my care, every moment that proved I had given up my life to keep her comfortable at home. There were letters from her primary care doctor stating that my care prevented nursing home placement, forms from Medicare showing I was listed as her primary caregiver, even a notarized statement from 6 months ago, where a doctor confirmed that without my full-time care, grandmother would have required skilled nursing facility placement. I stayed up past midnight reading through grandmother's notes, many of them praising my patience and dedication in her own words. She documented every doctor who told her I was preventing decline, every neighbor who commented on my devotion, every sacrifice I made to keep her home and comfortable. One entry from a year ago made me cry, so hard I had to put the folder down. My special baby gave up her job, her friends, her whole life to take care of me. Julius called twice this year, both times asking for money. He has never once asked how I am feeling or if I need anything. I know who loves me. I know who deserves my home. The words swam on the page as tears dripped onto the paper. She knew. She had always known. And she had prepared for this exact situation, documented everything so carefully that no one could argue I hadn't earned this house with 3 years of my life. The next morning, I arrived at Mr. Schwartz's office with the entire care file in a canvas tote bag. The receptionist showed me to a conference room where Mr. Schwartz was waiting with his briefcase open on the table. His eyes lit up when he saw the documentation. I lifted the banker's box onto the table and started pulling out folders. His expression changed as he realized what he was looking at. "This isn't just my word against Julius's anymore," he said quietly, flipping through the care logs. "This is 3 years of contemporaneous evidence that no court can ignore." He spent the next hour going through every folder, every document, every note grandmother had written. He made copies of the most important records and took detailed notes about the medical statements. When he got to grandmother's personal notes about Julius calling only to ask for money, he actually smiled. "Your grandmother was a very smart woman," he said. "She knew exactly what might happen and she made sure you had the proof you needed." I sat there feeling grateful and heartbroken at the same time, knowing that grandmother had spent her final months preparing to protect me from her own family. Mr. Schwartz closed the last folder and looked at me with serious eyes. He said we needed to file an emergency petition right away to stop Julius from selling or getting rid of any more property. He pulled out his laptop and started typing a motion for something called a temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction that would freeze all the estate assets immediately. His fingers moved fast across the keyboard while I sat there watching, still holding one of grandmother's care logs in my lap. He explained that this order would legally prevent Julius from touching anything until the court decided who really inherited the house. The whole process felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life instead of living my own. Mr. Schwartz printed out several copies of the motion and had me sign where he marked with little yellow tabs. We spent the next 2 hours going through the care file page by page while he took notes and made more copies. He spread the documents across the conference table, organizing them into piles based on what they proved. The medical appointment records went in one stack, the medication schedules in another, the daily care logs in a third pile. Mr. Schwartz kept stopping to point out important details, like how grandmother had a doctor sign a statement 6 months ago, confirming that my care prevented nursing home placement. He said that single document was worth more than any testimony, because it proved a medical professional believed I was providing skilled care. The Medicare documentation showed I was listed as her primary caregiver on all the official forms. Every folder we opened revealed more proof that grandmother had carefully documented my sacrifice. Mr. Schwartz made notes about which documents to submit as exhibits and which witnesses we might need. I mentioned the neighbor Humphrey who lived next door and watched me help grandmother for years. Mr. Schwartz stopped writing and looked up at me. He said eyewitness testimony would strengthen our case a lot, especially from someone who had no reason to lie or take sides. He asked me to get a written statement from Humphrey as soon as possible, preferably today if I could manage it. I nodded and wrote down exactly what Mr. Schwartz wanted the statement to include. That afternoon, I walked next door to Humphrey's house, my stomach tight with nerves about asking for help. Humphrey and his wife had lived there for 30 years and always waved when they saw me helping grandmother to the car for doctor visits. I knocked on his door and waited, practicing what I would say in my head. He opened the door with a warm smile that made some of the tension leave my shoulders. Before I could even explain why I was there, he said he had been waiting for me to come by because he saw what Julius tried to do with the moving truck. He invited me inside and his wife brought us sweet tea while we sat at the kitchen table. I explained what Mr. Schwartz needed and Humphrey nodded like he had expected this. He pulled out a pad of paper and started writing in careful handwriting, stopping sometimes to think about the exact words. The statement he wrote was detailed and clear, describing how he watched me care for grandmother through her decline over 3 years. He wrote about seeing me help her to doctor appointments every week, hearing me read to her every evening through the open windows in summer, noticing how I never went anywhere because she needed constant supervision. He described watching me bring in groceries, helping her walk to the mailbox, sitting with her on the porch during good weather days. His wife added details too, like how she never saw Julius visit except twice, both times staying less than an hour. Humphrey signed and dated the statement, then had his wife sign as a witness. He handed it to me and squeezed my shoulder, telling me that grandmother had been lucky to have me. I thanked him and walked back home with the statement folded carefully in my pocket. Back home, I started photographing every room with my phone, taking pictures of the scuff marks Julius's friends left on the hardwood and the empty spaces where furniture used to sit. I opened a spreadsheet on my laptop and began listing every missing item with estimated values based on what I remembered grandmother saying they were worth. The jewelry alone was worth thousands, according to the appraisal papers I found in her desk drawer. Julius's online posts were still up on the marketplace sites, showing grandmother's antique furniture for sale with prices that made my stomach hurt. I started screenshotting all of Julius's social media posts advertising grandmother's belongings, making sure to capture the timestamps that showed he posted them during the funeral reception. Mr. Schwartz had said this evidence of his money-focused attitude would help show why the caregiver statute exists in the first place. I saved each screenshot with clear file names so I could find them easily later. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom asking why I was making things difficult and suggesting we should share the house like family. I stared at the message for a long time, reading it over and over. Finally, I typed back that Julius tried to evict me and steal everything. So no, we would not be sharing anything. Her response came fast, saying I was being selfish and tearing the family apart. I turned off my phone and set it face down on the table. That night, I lay awake in grandmother's bed worrying about property taxes and utility bills that were probably due soon. Grandmother's accounts were frozen pending probate, and I had maybe $2,000 in savings from the part-time job I quit to care for her full-time. The house needed repairs too, things I had noticed, but grandmother could not afford to fix. The roof leaked in one corner of the attic. The furnace made weird noises, and several windows did not close right anymore. I tried to calculate how much everything would cost, but the numbers just made my head hurt worse. The next morning, Mr. Schwartz called to say the emergency hearing was scheduled for next week, and Julius had been served with the restraining order. His voice sounded pleased about how fast the court moved on our petition. Then his tone changed, and he warned me that Julius would probably show up here angry, and I should call the police immediately if he tried to enter the property. I promised I would and hung up feeling scared about what Julius might do. I spent the rest of that day pulling together every piece of evidence I could find. The care logs came out of the banker's box first, and I sorted them by month into clear plastic folders. Medical records went into another folder organized by doctor and date. Humphrey's handwritten statement got its own protective sleeve because I knew how important his witness testimony would be. I printed out all the screenshots of Julius's social media posts, selling grandmother's furniture, and put them in chronological order with the timestamps visible. The photos I took of the damaged floors and empty spaces where furniture used to sit went into another folder. Each folder felt like building a wall between me and Julius's lies. By the time I finished, the dining room table was covered in organized evidence that told the story of 3 years caring for grandmother while Julius stayed away. I labeled everything with sticky notes so Mr. Schwartz could find what he needed quickly. The jewelry appraisal papers went on top of the folder showing what Julius stole. I made copies of the most important documents and put them in a separate envelope just in case something happened to the originals. The work kept my hands busy and my mind focused on something other than fear. That evening around 7, I heard a truck pull up fast in the driveway. Heavy footsteps stomped up to the front door, and then Julius started pounding on it with his fists. I froze in the kitchen holding a folder of medical records. His voice came through the door loud and angry, saying he had every right to be in his house. He kept banging and yelling that I couldn't lock him out of his own property. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and dialed the police. The dispatcher asked if I felt unsafe, and I said yes because Julius was violating the restraining order. She told me officers were on their way and to stay inside away from the doors. Julius kept pounding and shouting while I waited. He yelled that Mr. Schwartz was a senile old man who didn't know what he was talking about. He said the caregiver law was fake, and I had manipulated grandmother into writing those care logs. The pounding got louder, and I worried he might actually break through. Then I heard sirens and saw red and blue lights flash through the front windows. The pounding stopped. I heard Julius's voice change to something calmer as he talked to the police officers. I stayed in the kitchen clutching my phone until someone knocked gently and announced it was the police. Through the window, I saw 2 officers standing on the porch while Julius sat in his truck with his arms crossed. I opened the door and one officer asked if I was okay. I nodded and showed them the restraining order paperwork. They explained they had already told Julius he was violating the court order, and if he came back, he would be arrested for trespassing. The other officer walked over to Julius's truck, and I watched them talk for a few minutes. Julius kept gesturing at the house and shaking his head. Finally, the officer pointed down the street and Julius started his truck. He drove away slowly, and I could see him staring at the house as he passed. The officers gave me their card and told me to call immediately if he came back. After they left, I locked the door and slid down to sit on the floor with my back against it. My whole body was shaking and I couldn't stop. Julius really believed he deserved everything here. He actually thought showing up twice in 3 years to ask for money meant he should inherit the house. The golden child thing ran so deep in him that he couldn't even see how wrong his behavior was. Mom had spent his whole life telling him he was special and successful and destined for great things. She never made him face consequences or admit when he was wrong. Now he was 30 years old and genuinely confused about why the law didn't just give him what he wanted. I sat there on the floor for a long time trying to stop shaking. The next day, Mom called while I was eating breakfast. Her voice was already crying before I even said hello. She kept saying I was tearing the family apart and couldn't I just drop the legal action. She said Julius was so upset and this was destroying him. I asked her if she remembered Julius showing up to grandmother's funeral with an eviction notice. There was silence on the other end. I asked if she remembered him loading grandmother's belongings into a truck while I was still grieving. More silence. I told her that Julius tore this family apart the second he decided grandmother's house was his personal inheritance check. She started crying harder and saying I was being cruel. I hung up because I couldn't listen to her defend him anymore. Later that afternoon, my email dinged and I saw a message from Mr. Schwartz with an attachment. I opened the PDF and started reading the emergency petition he had filed with the court. The legal language was formal and precise, but it described everything I had done for grandmother over 3 years. It listed the round-the-clock care and medication management and how I quit my job to prevent nursing home placement. It mentioned the documented medical appointments and the Medicare records showing me as primary caregiver. Reading it made me cry because someone finally saw what I sacrificed. Even if it was just a lawyer doing his job, it felt like validation after years of family members calling me the failure who couldn't keep a real job. The petition asked the court to recognize my legal right to the estate under the caregiver statute and to prevent Julius from taking or selling any more property. I printed it out and added it to my evidence folders. While I was organizing papers, I opened grandmother's desk drawer looking for stamps and found a stack of bills rubber-banded together. Property tax notice stamped overdue in red ink. Homeowner's insurance bill with a final notice warning. 3 months of utility bills all past due. I spread them out on the desk and added up the totals. Over $3,000 in bills that grandmother couldn't pay before she died. My stomach hurt looking at the numbers because I had maybe $2,000 in my savings account and no access to grandmother's bank accounts. Everything was frozen for probate. I called Mr. Schwartz and explained about the bills. He sighed and said I could petition the court for emergency funds from the estate to maintain the property. But it required another hearing and more paperwork. He would file the motion this week, but the court might take 2 or 3 weeks to schedule it. I asked what happened if the utilities got shut off in the meantime. He said I should pay what I could and explain the probate situation to the utility companies. Everything moved so slowly while the bills kept piling up and I had no income. The next morning, I went online and applied to every temp agency in the area. One agency called back that afternoon and said they had a placement at a medical office doing filing and scheduling. It was part-time and the pay wasn't great, but it was something. After 3 years of round-the-clock caregiving with no breaks, the idea of a regular schedule felt almost manageable. I started the following Monday and spent my days organizing patient files and answering phones. The work was simple and the office manager seemed nice. It felt strange to have a routine again after so long. 2 days into the new job, my phone rang during lunch break. A woman introduced herself as Rhea Collins from the legal aid office. She said Mr. Schwartz had referred my case to her for a second opinion on the caregiver statute. She had reviewed all the documentation I provided and wanted me to know the law was clear and well established in our state. Her voice was confident and matter-of-fact. She explained that courts had ruled in favor of caregivers over absent relatives in dozens of cases. The statute existed specifically to protect people like me who sacrificed their careers to care for elderly family members. Rhea said she wanted to help draft additional supporting documents pro bono, because cases like mine were exactly why the caregiver statute was created. She talked about elder care and family exploitation with real passion in her voice. It made me feel less alone in this fight to have someone who understood why the law mattered. She asked if I could meet her at the legal aid office tomorrow to go over strategy, and I agreed. For the first time since grandmother died, I felt like maybe I had people on my side who actually saw what happened and cared about making it right. The hearing date arrived 3 weeks later, and I sat in the courtroom with Mr. Schwartz at a table covered in organized folders. My hands shook while I watched Julius walk in with his lawyer, a tall man in an expensive suit who carried a thin briefcase like he barely needed any evidence. The courtroom smelled like old wood and floor polish, and the judge's bench loomed above us, making everything feel official and scary. Mr. Schwartz stood up when the judge entered and started presenting the care file piece by piece, holding up grandmother's handwritten logs and explaining how she documented every medication dose and doctor visit for 3 years. He showed the Medicare records listing me as primary caregiver and read from Humphrey's sworn statement about watching me help grandmother to appointments and never leaving her alone. Julius's lawyer argued that family property should be divided equally no matter who did the caregiving, because that's what fair inheritance meant. He said the caregiver statute was misapplied and that I had lived rent-free, so I already got my compensation. The judge flipped through grandmother's documentation for what felt like forever, her reading glasses sliding down her nose while she studied each page. Then she looked up directly at Julius and asked when he last visited grandmother before the funeral. Julius stammered something about being busy with his job and having important responsibilities. The judge's expression hardened and she asked again for a specific date. Julius said maybe 6 months ago, then changed it to 8 months, then admitted he wasn't exactly sure. Mr. Schwartz pulled out phone records showing Julius called grandmother once a month at most, and the calls lasted under 5 minutes. The judge reviewed Humphrey's statement about Julius visiting twice in 3 years, both times leaving after 20 minutes, and her mouth pressed into a thin line. She asked Julius's lawyer if he had any evidence that Julius provided care or financial support, and the lawyer shuffled papers but couldn't produce anything concrete. The judge announced she was granting a temporary order giving me exclusive occupancy of the house and prohibiting Julius from removing or selling any estate property while probate proceeded. She said the caregiver statute was clear, and the documentation supported my claim, though final ownership would be determined after full probate review. I felt my chest loosen for the first time in weeks, knowing I could stay in grandmother's house safely without Julius showing up with another U-Haul. Mr. Schwartz squeezed my shoulder and whispered that this was a good outcome, that temporary orders usually predicted final rulings. Julius's face turned purple as the judge explained the order and what it meant. We walked out into the courthouse hallway and Julius exploded, screaming that I manipulated grandmother and forged all the documents. His voice echoed off the marble walls and people stopped to stare while he yelled about how I stole his inheritance and tricked everyone. His lawyer grabbed his arm trying to pull him away, but Julius shook him off and kept shouting. Mr. Schwartz stood there calmly and reminded Julius that outbursts wouldn't help his case, that the judge had made her ruling based on evidence. A courthouse security guard walked over and told Julius to lower his voice or leave the building. Julius finally let his lawyer drag him toward the exit, still muttering about suing everyone involved. I drove home exhausted, but relieved to have legal protection, even if it was only temporary. The house felt safer when I unlocked the door, knowing Julius couldn't just show up and take things anymore. I collapsed on the couch still wearing my courthouse clothes and stared at the ceiling trying to process everything that happened. The temp job started tomorrow and I needed to figure out how to pay the overdue utility bills before they shut anything off. That night I barely slept, my mind racing through budgets and bill due dates and whether the estate accounts would get unfrozen soon. My first day at the temp agency placement went smoothly once I got there and focused on the work. The medical office had files everywhere that needed organizing, and the phone rang constantly with patients calling to schedule appointments. The office manager was a woman in her 50s named Kendall, who showed me the filing system and explained how their scheduling software worked. She mentioned they might have a permanent position opening soon if I did well, and steady income would solve so many problems right now. I spent the day alphabetizing patient records and answering basic questions, and the routine felt almost normal after 3 years of unpredictable caregiving schedules. Kendall complimented my organization skills before I left and said she'd see me tomorrow. I came home to find a letter from Julius's lawyer sitting in the mailbox proposing mediation to resolve this matter amicably. The formal language made it sound reasonable, but I knew Julius just wanted money or property in exchange for dropping his claim. I called Mr. Schwartz and he said mediation might be worth trying, that it could save time and legal fees if we reached an agreement. But he warned me to prepare for Julius to demand half the house value or specific items, and I shouldn't agree to anything without his review. That weekend, I finally worked up the courage to deep clean grandmother's bedroom, which still smelled like her lavender lotion, and contained all her personal items exactly where she left them. Her hairbrush sat on the dresser with silver strands still caught in the bristles. I opened her closet and saw the dresses she wore to church hanging in neat rows, and going through them made me cry so hard I had to sit on the floor. I carefully packed away her favorite blue dress with the pearl buttons and the green one she wore to my high school graduation, folding them in tissue paper to keep forever. Her jewelry box sat empty on the dresser where Julius had dumped everything into his garbage bag, and the sight of it made me angry all over again. I cleaned the room slowly, dusting every surface and changing the sheets, trying to honor her memory by taking care of her space. Mom showed up unannounced on Sunday afternoon while I was folding grandmother's clothes. She knocked and walked right in before I could answer, asking to talk things through like nothing had happened. She said I was being unreasonable about the whole situation, and that family should work together. I told her that Julius literally tried to evict me at grandmother's funeral and steal everything, but she waved her hand dismissively and said he was just protecting his interests. Her voice had that same tone she used when I was a kid, and she'd excuse Julius for breaking my toys or taking my allowance. I asked her how she could defend someone who showed up with a U-Haul while I was still grieving, and she said Julius was under a lot of stress. The conversation got worse when I pushed her to explain why she always took his side. Mom finally admitted she always gave Julius more because he needed the confidence boost while I was naturally capable and could handle things on my own. She said it out loud like it was a reasonable parenting strategy, like treating your kids unequally was fine if you had a good excuse. Hearing her finally say what I always knew didn't make it hurt less. My throat felt tight and I had to look away because crying in front of her would just prove I wasn't as capable as she claimed. She tried to touch my arm, but I stepped back and told her I needed her to leave. Mom looked surprised, like she expected me to accept her explanation and move on. She gathered her purse and walked to the door saying I'd understand when I calmed down, and I watched her drive away knowing nothing would change between us unless I set real boundaries. I walked Mom to the door and told her I couldn't keep a relationship with her if she kept defending Julius and acting like my 3 years meant nothing. She stared at me like I'd slapped her and started crying, saying I was choosing money over family. I told her Julius chose money when he showed up with an eviction notice at the funeral and she had no response to that. She grabbed her purse and walked out, and I watched her car pull away feeling this weird mix of guilt and relief, like I'd finally said something that needed saying years ago. The house felt quieter after she left, and I sat on the couch wrapped in the quilts trying to figure out if setting boundaries was supposed to hurt this much. Mr. Schwartz called 2 days later while I was making coffee. Julius's lawyer had requested access to grandmother's financial records, which was normal procedure in probate cases, but Mr. Schwartz warned me they were probably looking for any sign I'd taken advantage of her financially. The idea made me so angry I almost dropped my mug because I'd quit my job and spent my own savings keeping her comfortable. He told me to gather any records I had showing how money was spent during those 3 years, and I promised to go through everything that evening. I spent hours at grandmother's desk that night pulling out bank statements and receipts from the past 3 years. Every statement told the same story, with her Social Security going toward property taxes and utilities, while I covered the gaps with my own money. I used a yellow highlighter to mark every expense that was clearly for her care, and the pages ended up covered in bright yellow lines. Pharmacy receipts for her medications, grocery store purchases, medical equipment rentals. The records showed I'd spent over $15,000 of my own money when her funds ran low, and seeing it all laid out made me realize how much I'd sacrificed without even thinking about it. Ria showed up at my door 3 days later carrying a thick folder of legal research. She'd found multiple case precedents from our state where courts ruled in favor of caregivers over absent relatives, and she was building a legal brief that made our position almost impossible to challenge. We sat at the kitchen table while she walked me through each case, explaining how judges consistently sided with people who provided actual care. One case involved a grandson who quit his job to care for his grandfather, and the court awarded him the entire estate over 3 siblings who never visited. Another case had a daughter who provided 5 years of care, and the judge wrote a scathing opinion about family members who only appeared after death expecting inheritance. Ria's passion about elder care law made me feel less alone in this whole mess. The mediation happened 2 weeks later in a conference room downtown with fluorescent lights that hurt my eyes. Julius sat across the table with his lawyer looking smug like he'd already won. Mom sat next to him, which felt like another betrayal, even though I'd expected it. Mr. Schwartz sat beside me with all our documentation in neat folders. The mediator was a tired-looking woman in her 60s who explained the ground rules before asking Julius to state his position. He immediately demanded I pay him half the house's value, which came to around $150,000. His lawyer presented it like a reasonable compromise, but the whole thing was absurd since Julius had contributed absolutely nothing to grandmother's care or the house maintenance. I looked directly at Julius and told him he needed to return the jewelry and furniture he stole or pay their fair market value before we discussed anything else. His lawyer shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable because the restraining order had technically prohibited Julius from taking those items in the first place. Julius's face went red and he started arguing that he had a right to family heirlooms, but Mr. Schwartz calmly pointed out that stealing property during an illegal eviction attempt wasn't exercising rights. The mediator made notes and asked if we could move past that point, but I refused because those items mattered, and Julius needed to face consequences for his actions. Mom jumped in with her usual peacemaking voice, suggesting we split everything down the middle to be fair to everyone. I turned to her and asked what was fair about Julius getting half of a house he never helped maintain, while I gave up 3 years of my life and my entire career. She looked away and said family should share equally, but I reminded her that Julius hadn't treated me like family when he showed up with an eviction notice. Mr. Schwartz added that the law specifically rejected equal division in cases where one party provided all the care and the other provided nothing. Mom's face crumpled, but she didn't have an answer to that. The mediation dragged on for 2 more hours, with Julius refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing and me refusing to give him money he didn't earn. His lawyer tried different compromise proposals, but they all involved me paying Julius significant amounts or giving up portions of the property. I held firm on my position that the caregiver statute was clear, and I wasn't negotiating away what grandmother intended me to have. The mediator finally noted our positions for the court record and scheduled the full probate hearing for 6 weeks out. Julius stormed out of the conference room without looking at me, and Mom followed him after giving me a disappointed look that I ignored. I left the courthouse feeling completely drained, but certain I'd made the right choice by not caving to Julius's demands. Mr. Schwartz walked me to my car and reassured me that we had the stronger case, and the law clearly supported caregivers in these situations. He said Julius's lawyer probably knew they'd lose but was trying mediation to see if I'd settle for less than I deserved. I drove home and collapsed on the couch, too exhausted to even make dinner. Work became my refuge over the next several weeks as I settled into the medical office routine and proved myself reliable. Kendall complimented my organizational skills and how quickly I'd learned their systems. The phones never stopped ringing and the filing seemed endless, but having structure and purpose felt good after years of unpredictable caregiving schedules. One afternoon, Kendall called me into her office and officially offered me the permanent position with full benefits starting next month. I accepted immediately and felt this rush of relief because steady income meant I could handle the property taxes and bills without panic. It was the first genuinely good news I'd had in months, and I actually smiled driving home that evening. My first paycheck arrived 2 weeks later, and I immediately went to the bank to cash it. I drove straight to the utility company office and paid the electric bill that was 3 months overdue. The water bill came next, then the gas bill, and watching those balances drop to zero felt like lifting weights off my chest. I still had the property taxes hanging over me, though. A massive $4,000 bill that my paycheck barely made a dent in. Mr. Schwartz called that afternoon and said he filed a motion with the court to release estate funds for essential property maintenance. He explained that judges usually granted these requests because letting a house fall apart during probate hurt everyone involved. The hearing for that motion was scheduled 2 weeks before the main probate case. I thanked him and hung up, feeling slightly less panicked about losing the house to unpaid taxes. That evening, I sat on the porch watching the sun go down and thinking about how grandmother used to sit in this exact spot every evening. A car pulled into the driveway and Humphrey got out carrying a covered dish that smelled amazing. He walked up the porch steps with a gentle smile and handed me the casserole. I invited him to sit, and he settled into the chair next to me without needing to be asked twice. We sat there for a while just looking at the street before he started talking about grandmother. He told me about the time she chased off a door-to-door salesman with a broom because he was too pushy. He described how she used to bring him soup when his wife was sick years ago. Then he said something that made my throat tight. He told me that grandmother talked about me all the time, bragging to anyone who would listen about how I quit my job to take care of her. She told him I was the only one who really loved her, the only one who showed up when it mattered. Tears started running down my face and I couldn't stop them. Humphrey patted my hand and said, "Grandmother knew what Julius was like, knew what Mom was like, and she made sure I would be taken care of when she was gone." We sat there until it got dark and the casserole got cold. The next morning, I was going through grandmother's desk looking for more bill statements when I found a folder tucked in the very back drawer. Inside was a handwritten document dated 3 years ago, right when I moved in. It was an agreement stating that I would inherit the house in exchange for providing full-time care until grandmother passed. At the bottom were 2 signatures, grandmother's shaky writing and Humphrey's neat print as the witness. My hands shook as I read it 3 times to make sure I understood what I was looking at. I grabbed my phone and called Mr. Schwartz immediately. He told me to bring it to his office right away. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from him while he examined the document with a huge grin on his face. He explained that this contemporaneous agreement proved grandmother's intent beyond any doubt. It showed she planned for me to inherit from the very beginning, that this wasn't some last-minute decision or confusion. He made copies and added it to our evidence file. Julius's lawyer called Mr. Schwartz 2 days later with another settlement offer. They would drop the entire claim if I paid Julius $20,000. Mr. Schwartz actually laughed out loud on the phone. He told them we would see them in court because the law did not require caregivers to buy off greedy relatives who contributed nothing. He hung up and called me to relay the conversation. I felt this surge of satisfaction knowing that Julius's lawyer was getting desperate. The probate hearing finally arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in late October. I wore the nicest clothes I owned and met Mr. Schwartz outside the courthouse at 8:30. We went through security and found the courtroom on the 3rd floor. Julius was already there with his lawyer and Mom sat in the gallery behind them. She would not look at me. The judge came in and we all stood up. She was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. The hearing started with opening statements from both lawyers. Then it was my turn to testify. I walked to the witness stand and put my hand on the Bible. The clerk swore me in and I sat down facing the courtroom. Mr. Schwartz asked me to describe the 3 years I spent caring for grandmother. I told the judge about changing her diapers when she could not make it to the bathroom anymore. I described managing 8 different medications 3 times a day and keeping detailed logs so I would not miss a dose. I explained how I read to her every night because her eyes were too weak to read herself. I talked about giving up my social life, my career, my entire existence outside that house to keep her comfortable at home. Mr. Schwartz showed the judge my care logs and the medical records documenting every doctor visit. I testified that I never went on vacation, never spent a night away, never did anything that took me away from grandmother for more than a few hours. The judge listened carefully and took notes. When Mr. Schwartz finished, Julius's lawyer asked if I expected to be paid for caring for my own grandmother. I looked him right in the eye and said I did not expect payment. I expected basic human decency from my family, but I did not get that either. Humphrey testified next. He described watching me help grandmother in and out of the car for doctor appointments. He talked about hearing me read to her through the open windows on summer evenings. He confirmed that he witnessed the agreement 3 years ago, and that grandmother specifically told him she wanted me to have the house. The doctor who treated grandmother submitted a written statement that Mr. Schwartz read into the record. It confirmed that my care prevented nursing home placement and significantly extended grandmother's quality of life. Without my intervention, she would have ended up in a facility within months of her diagnosis. Then Julius took the stand. He testified that he visited whenever he could and sent money occasionally to help with expenses. Mr. Schwartz pulled out phone records showing Julius called grandmother maybe once a month. He produced visitor logs from grandmother's doctors showing Julius attended exactly 0 appointments in 3 years. Then Mr. Schwartz asked Julius about the 2 times he did visit. Julius got flustered and tried to dodge the question. Mr. Schwartz pressed him until Julius admitted that both visits involved asking grandmother for money to cover his expenses. The judge's expression hardened. She asked Julius directly when he last had a conversation with grandmother that was not about money. He could not answer. The judge reviewed all the evidence while we sat in silence. She looked at the care logs, the medical records, the handwritten agreement, Humphrey's testimony, the doctor's statement. Then she looked up and started speaking. She said the law clearly entitled me to the estate as the primary caregiver who sacrificed employment to provide care. She explained that the caregiver statute existed for exactly this situation. Julius's face turned purple and his hands gripped the table. The judge kept talking. She said the statute was designed to prevent situations where absent relatives exploited those who actually provided care. She noted that I had documented proof of 3 solid years of full-time caregiving, while Julius had proof of 2 visits where he asked for money. The house, the accounts, and all property were awarded to me subject to estate debts and taxes. Julius started to stand up, but his lawyer pulled him back down. The judge was not finished. She ordered Julius to return all items he removed from the house or pay their fair market value within 30 days. She said his behavior at the funeral and afterward demonstrated exactly the kind of opportunistic conduct the statute was designed to address. She signed the order, and the bailiff handed copies to both lawyers. The hearing was over. Mr. Schwartz pulled Julius's lawyer aside in the hallway outside the courtroom, while Julius sat on a bench looking defeated. They talked for about 10 minutes while I stood with my back against the wall trying to process everything that just happened. When they came back, Mr. Schwartz explained that Julius's lawyer wanted to negotiate a payment plan instead of forcing Julius to come up with thousands of dollars immediately for the missing jewelry. Julius would return whatever furniture he still had in storage within 2 weeks and pay $300 every month for 18 months to cover the value of the jewelry he took. It was not ideal because I knew Julius probably already sold or spent most of what he grabbed, but Mr. Schwartz said it was realistic and enforceable through the court. I agreed to the terms, and both lawyers drafted the agreement right there in the hallway. Julius signed without looking at me, and his lawyer handed Mr. Schwartz the paperwork. The whole negotiation took maybe 20 minutes, and then Julius walked away toward the parking lot without saying a word. I walked out of the courthouse feeling vindicated but completely exhausted, like I had just finished running a marathon while carrying grandmother's antique dresser on my back. The legal victory was real and documented, but it did not erase the fact that my family was basically destroyed. Mom sent a text before I even made it to my car. The message said she was disappointed in how this turned out and hoped I was happy with myself. I stared at those words for a long time sitting in the driver's seat. Then I put my phone in my pocket without responding. There was nothing left to say to someone who still could not see what Julius did wrong or what I sacrificed. The estate accounts got unfrozen 3 days later after Mr. Schwartz filed the court order with the bank. I could finally access the funds grandmother left to pay property taxes and all the overdue bills that had been piling up for months. The first thing I did was pay the property tax bill that was almost 60 days past due. Then I paid the homeowner's insurance, the utility bills, and scheduled repairs for the leaky bathroom faucet that had been dripping since before grandmother died. Mr. Schwartz helped me set up a proper budget for maintaining the house and managing what was left in the estate accounts after paying off the debts. He showed me how to track expenses and plan for future costs like roof maintenance and furnace replacement. Having a clear financial picture made everything feel more manageable and less overwhelming. Julius's first payment arrived exactly on time 2 weeks later, probably because his lawyer explained what would happen if he violated a court order. The check for $300 sat in my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon. I opened the envelope, looked at Julius's signature on the check, and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no sadness. I deposited it through my phone banking app and watched the money transfer into my account. This was what our relationship was now. A monthly transaction with no emotion attached. He would send money, I would deposit it, and we would never speak about grandmother or the house or anything else that mattered. I spent that evening on the front porch wrapped in the quilts grandmother and I made together piece by piece over 3 years of quiet afternoons. The fabric still smelled faintly like her lavender lotion. I pulled out her note and read it again in the fading sunlight. My special baby, they called you the family failure, but not anymore. The house was mine, legally and completely. The bills were manageable with my new permanent job at the medical office. I had set firm boundaries with the family members who never valued my sacrifice, and probably never would. It was not a perfect ending because endings are never perfect in real life. But it was real, and it was mine, and grandmother knew I deserved it even when nobody else did. And that's how love and dedication won in the end. Stories like this remind me why I do what I do, honestly. If you enjoyed watching this unfold, hit that like button and maybe share it with someone who needs to hear that good things happen to good people. Subscribe for more heartwarming stories, and I'll see you in the next one.